Hey, hey. Hello, everybody. Happy Tuesday and welcome back to Night Shift with Andrea Up Late. I hope you guys are getting a good, we are close to that camera tonight. I hope you guys are getting a good start to your week and everything is going well for you. If you are not familiar, Night Shift is a true crime podcast. We air weekly on YouTube on the Andrea Up Late YouTube channel at 8, 7 Central every Tuesday night. But we also drop and you can stream wherever you listen to your podcast. So I'll go on and get the annoying stuff out of the way. Please subscribe, like all that silly stuff that we ask you to do. And there's a reason for it. So that's what really helps us out. We do over here at Night Shift, I will often have a rotating co host. I want you guys to suggest some more as time goes on. We've got some interesting people that we've had so far, and I look forward to some new folks on the horizon. Tonight, I am solo, and sometimes I enjoy a show just like that as well. So, we are talking tonight, guys, about a case that is boggling my mind. The more I read, the more I want to know. It's the Hendricks family murders. This took place back in Illinois in 1983. All right. There are some cases where they're kind of open and shut, or we feel like we know one way or another how things went. This is an unsolved case. And people are definitely in two very polarized camps about this and about their ideas and opinions on what took place this November night of 1983 and exactly who committed this crime. My feelings have changed 17 different times in researching this. I feel like I know where I land now, but this is one that I absolutely look forward to hearing from you guys, seeing what you're saying in the chat, seeing what you're saying on Instagram, on YouTube. Leave comments, let me know, send me a message, whatever, because I'm just really curious to hear your opinion on this. And if you are a listener, you know that we go back and talk about a little bit of pop culture, depending on the year of which the crime took place that we're highlighting that. 83. Last week we covered a case, White Boy Rick, the Richard Wershey story, and that took place in 84. And I learned that all things that took place in the 80s that were good happened in 84. So let's talk a little bit about 83, though, and we'll see what we have there. We got Richard Noble setting the land speed record at 633 miles per hour. So we have miles per hour, excuse me. We have the Space Shuttle Challenger launching its maiden flight. The first person to receive an artificial heart actually died after 112 days. So that was a big deal then. We now know that, or maybe you don't, but artificial hearts can last for much longer than that now. Our technology has grown quite a lot. We have Swatches came out in 1983. We've got Cats winning the best musical at the Tonys. I would love to tell you guys that I love the Tonys and Broadway. Can't dig it. I've got other things, though. We'll talk, all right? We got milk at $1.35 a gallon. A gallon of gas was around 96 cents. We got He-Man, Alvin and the Chipmunks, Inspector Gadget, Mr. T. What do y'all think? Mr. T, right? We can stop it right there. We have Flashdance, Tootsie, The Dark Crystal. I wasn't a fan, so I'm sorry about that. But we do have Scarface, so that more than makes up for it. We have Airplane 2, Strange Brew. We have Mama's Family, Wheel of Fortune, Reading Rainbow, The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross. All right, guys. So 83 wasn't so bad after all. All right. You know what? Let's dive in. We have a lot to cover and not a lot of time to do it. So let's do it. All right. We are going to be talking again, like I said, about the Hendricks family out of Illinois on November 8th of 1983. The bodies of 30-year-old Susan Hendricks, 9-year-old Becky, her daughter, 7-year-old Grace, her other daughter, and 5-year-old Benjamin were found slaughtered in their beds. This case remains unsolved, as I said earlier. So David Hendricks was the husband and father to the family that was murdered. David was not home when this happened. So let's talk a little bit about David. Okay. David Hendricks was born in Morton Grove, Illinois, and raised in Oak Park. He and his family were members of the exclusive branch of the Plymouth Brethren. Okay, so exclusive branch is all capitalized. This is all the name of this religion. This is deemed a sect of Christianity, if you will. I think the members of that religion would call it straight on Christianity. It has been coined by others to be a bit fundamentalist in nature, a little bit more of a Puritan outlook on Christianity. So, needless to say, they were a bit strict, very straight-laced in that kind of way. So David was one of 7 siblings. He's always been a very intelligent boy growing up. He always was. This did not change as he became a young man. He attended the Northwestern University's prosthetics and orthotics program, and he actually graduated at an accelerated rate. So he graduated there early. So he's getting a head start on life a little bit in terms of his career. And he goes on to start his own prosthetics and orthopedics company. All right. So that's pretty ambitious at this young age. At this point, he's like very early 20s. All right. And so that company manufactured spinal braces. I've got a picture here to give you an idea. If you are listening, this looks not unlike any other spinal brace that you might see now. This is one that is currently on sale. And this is actually from David's current company. Yes, he has a current company that is still selling these orthopedics, and we'll talk about that. But this is specifically the cash orthopedic system. But this is the 2023 model. As of today, it's on sale for $119 from $211 if you're interested or have scoliosis. I don't know. That's what they're for, actually. But anyway, this is what he starts manufacturing in the early 80s and his early 20s. Okay, so by November of 83, David actually owned his own orthotics business in Bloomington. Bloomington is another city there in Illinois. This was known as the Cash Manufacturing Inc. So Cash is all capital, CASH. It's an acronym that stands for cruciform anterior spinal hypertension. So this is a very specific type of back brace. And David not only engineered it, he developed it, he also patented and manufactured it. So he was an entrepreneur. He was tenacious with his business, and he reaped the rewards of this. He and Susan go on eventually to he's making tons of money with this at a very young age. So he's hands and fist over his peers at this point. So at this point, David worked at this company that he owned, and it was only himself and one other person, his office manager, a lady that went by the name of Beverly Crutcher. So it was common for David to travel for work. So he would travel to other cities to try to procure customers that would want to buy, or physicians that would want to prescribe this brace that he sold in their companies and in their businesses. So David has grown up, started this company, and he meets and marries Susan. Okay. He calls her Susie to this day. So I will often refer to her probably as Susie. They have 3 children, Rebecca, who goes by Becky, Grace, and Benjamin, the 3 that I listed just a little bit ago. All of these children were kind of stair-stepped in age between 1.5 years and 2 years apart. So the family spent a considerable amount of time at church. Now, Susan grew up not unlike David. So in terms of religion and her church going, she was very strict minded in that as well, like David was. So they go on to raise their children the same way. He's working hard at this business that he owns, and Susan is working hard at home as a homemaker there. So she's a stay-at-home mom, wife, and it sounds like she took a lot of pride in that and took very good care of their home and their children. So there were prescribed roles and rules for members of the church. Women, it sounds like, I'm not going to go in the specifics of their church because it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot, but it sounds like women don't have a ton of liberties in terms of being vocal or these kinds of things, or making decisions. So on Monday 7th of 1983, it was not really unlike any of the other days for the Hendricks family. The children were at school all day. Susan was at home and running errands, and David had been to work. So he leaves the office that day and gets home around 4 p.m. So when he comes home, again, it's November in Illinois. He's got a motorcycle, so he decides to go on and start the process of overwintering it. You have to take care of engines and these kinds of things if you're not going to be using it. So he goes on and takes care of the motorcycle. He then rides it down the street to his hangar. He had an airplane hangar not far from his home. So he rides the bike there, jogs back. He was healthy. He was into exercise. So he goes on and takes that jog back home. The kids eventually get home from school. They stay outside and they play until dark. It's around 5:30 p.m. and they're called in. Now, Susie's getting ready because Susie has a baby shower to go to. All right. So she's going to travel to a town about 40 miles away called Delavan. Okay. 35, 40 miles away for a baby shower for a friend of hers. And it's west of their home there in Bloomington. So when Susan leaves for the baby shower, this is between about 5:50 and 6 p.m. I will speak on a lot of times for this case because it's important. So she leaves between 10 till and 6 p.m. that Monday night for the baby shower. At this same time, almost exactly, David has gotten the kids together and he's taken them out to eat to Chuck E. Cheese. All right. Like, I don't think we even have any. You guys let me know if you have any where you live. I think they're all shut down, right? So there weren't very many pre-COVID. And then I think after, I think that took them out. If you're not familiar, Chuck E. Cheese is just, it had been around forever. And they have like arcades and ball pits and you can order pizza. Parents can get beer, whatever. And they had super creepy animatronic mouse. Chuck E. Cheese was a mouse and he was as big as a human male and he was on a stage, but he was animatronic and had a band, whatever. But kids always loved it growing up. So David's taken him out. When mom's gone off to the baby shower, this way he can order some pizza. The kids can play. That's going to be their evening. So they do. They get there and I think they get inside per witnesses right around 6:30 p.m. Everything so far is checking out on what David has later told police as to where he was this evening. So David and the kids order a medium vegetable pizza and a pitcher of root beer. Okay, so for David, he says that he ate one piece of this pizza and that the children ate most of the rest of it. This seems like I'm getting in the weeds, and I am, but there's a reason for it, and it's important to know about this food specifically. All right. So the kids eat most of the rest of it. The ingredients of the pizza, again, important, of this veggie pizza are the pizza dough, cheese, mushrooms, green peppers, olives, tomato slices, onions, and tomato sauce. Okay. Per David's account, they eat just around 7 p.m. by the time the pizza comes out to them. He says the kids didn't want to leave the play area. He's trying to kind of gather them up to get going. Now, David's got other things in his mind because he's going to leave that evening to go on a business trip. Remember those business trips we talked about earlier where he procures new clients and new customers to purchase his braces, orthotics braces, right? His spinal braces. So it was not unlike David to leave at nighttime and drive in the dark of night. I personally can't do that. I will fall asleep. I've never been able to or chosen to take trips that way. He does. Other people do as well. So this was not unlike David to leave for a trip in the evening. So he leaves the kids playing in the ball pit. Again, that's not even a big deal. Y'all, it was 1983, Chuck E. Cheese. They're having fun. He lets them play. He runs out real quick, hops in his car and goes and fills his tank up. So at least he's got, one more checked on the chore list. He comes back, grabs the kids. They get in the car and they're headed back toward the house because the bookmobile was going to be there. So a bookmobile, if you're not familiar, is kind of like a mobile book library. You can check out and return books from this essentially bus or van that drives around. So he knew the bookmobile would be coming to where they lived. So they leave Chuck E. Cheese. They eat at 7. They leave soon after that. And they go back home first to pick up books that the children need to return. So they get these books, go back to the bookmobile, and the children go in there and pick out new books. Now, this is probably around 8 o'clock. At least that's what David said. And this actually checks out because the operator of the bookmobile has come forward as a witness at the time to say that yes, indeed, David and the children were seen by him right at 8 p.m. that evening. This, as far as we know, is the last time that anyone else has seen these children alive. Okay. So they get home around 8:30 p.m. from the bookmobile. They've had a full day. They play some games. David says specifically that they played hide and seek. So they're running through the house. He then reads to them, as he says he does every night, and states that they're in their bed between 9 and 9:30. Now, while they're doing their bedtime chores and routines and brushing teeth and this kind of thing, David is getting ready for his trip. So he's kind of packing his suitcase, going and putting it in his car, and then they're in the bed. So again, they are in bed between 9 and 9:30 p.m. that Monday night of the 7th. Meanwhile, Susan is, remember, at the baby shower. So she's enjoying herself. I will say separately that I'm like happy to be in a phase of my life where baby showers aren't things that I'm doing, but either way, I digress. So there at the baby shower, she eats a veggie plate. This food is important. Trust me, guys. So she eats this veggie plate that consists of cauliflower, carrots, and celery. And she also ate some cookies and drank some punch while there. She ingests all of these things between 9:20 and 9:30. So we know that Susan ate this food between 9:20 and 9:30. We know that the children ate their food right around 7 o'clock. So mom's eaten about 2.5 hours after the kids did. Keep that up here in your noggin, all right? It's important. So she leaves the party, the baby shower, around 9:40 and gets home between 10:30 and 10:45, which that checks out. Again, she's about an hour away in that other city for the shower. David says that they have a bit of a conversation. Some accounts say that they were even potentially talking about the idea of adoption. There was a little boy up for adoption, and it sounds like they might have been having that conversation. He says he then kissed Susan and the kids goodbye. Now, at the trial, David states that he left the house a little after 11, but he tells the police instead, when they first get there, that he actually had left the house closer to midnight. This minutia doesn't necessarily matter, okay? Because that in and of itself, that one thing, when you're looking at the matter of 50 minutes or so, less than an hour discrepancy after a traumatic event, I don't find that to be a problem at all. We did not have phones in our hands with time on them constantly in 1983. Okay, so it's really important to remember what the time of the crime looked like. What does that year look like? And in 1983, you weren't constantly posting and Snapchatting and Instagramming and texting and whatever. So you had a clock on the wall and you might have a watch on. That's about it. So I'm not in the weeds with that. Other people don't like that discrepancy, but I don't find that to be a big deal. Honestly, really at all. So either way, he gets in his car though, after he and Susan have this conversation, kisses them all goodbye, and he heads out to go to Wisconsin, about 3.5 hours away, for his trip. Now it's the early morning hours of Tuesday, November 8th, and he has checked into a Red Roof Inn. He rests for a while, and he begins making his sales calls that morning. So later that afternoon, he tried calling home and no one answered. He didn't think much of it. Again, y'all, like, unless you had an answering machine, you wouldn't even know that someone called you. So if she's outside with the kids and he calls her, she's not going to see that she missed a phone call. And, so he's also not expecting to necessarily get her the second he calls her either. We had very different expectations about communication at that time. So he calls her and she doesn't answer. He goes about doing his business. He's still making calls and conducting business. It's a work trip. So throughout the day, here and there, he calls her and doesn't get her. He's starting to get a little more anxious in the evening. Now, that night, Susan and the children were supposed to go to her brother's house for a dinner party. So he now, in the evening or afternoon, when she's still not answering, he goes on and calls her brother's house. He answers and confirms that he's not seen her or heard from her or the children. Her mother is there at the brother's house. Mom says the same thing. She's not seen or heard from her. So finally, about an hour after she was supposed to have been to her brother's house for the dinner party, That's it. Like, that's enough for David. He goes on and calls 911. He calls police to at least do a welfare check. I've read transcripts. I would have the audio for you if it was available. I don't have any audio of David calling. They just have like the mock audio, and I don't like it when they have the fake voices because I want to hear his inflection, right? So you want to hear how he spoke when he initially is calling 911. That can be very, very telling. So rather than listen to, the play part of someone pretending to be him calling 911, I would just rather read the transcript on paper. And I've read the 2 calls that he made. Also, Susan's mother called as well. But he is basically calling saying, hey, I think something's up. It's not like my wife not to answer her phone. I think maybe she's had an accident. He thinks that she and the kids might have had like a car wreck or something. They go on, meaning dispatch, to try to alleviate his fears by saying, we haven't had any calls to dispatch about a broken down vehicle or about a car wreck. You guys, they were living in Bloomington at this time, a suburb there in Illinois. In 1983, Bloomington had a population of right around 100,000. So it was not a really huge town. And the authorities were pretty confident to say, basically, if we haven't heard anything, she's fine, or she's at least not on the roads. So why don't you call somebody to go check on her at the house? So he does eventually have them go to make that welfare check at the house. He just can't kind of sit with this when he's uneasy about it. So he, excuse me. So they do. And when the police get there, it's about 10:30 at night, and they are met by Susan's brother and her brother-in-law. You can imagine, I'm sure that's kind of how this went when David says he's going to be calling for a welfare check and her mom's already at the brothers for the dinner party, right? I can see you guys go check on her, see what's going on. I'm going to read to you here a little bit about what the police find at the crime scene. Again, this is not for small children, and this does involve child death. So it's a bit graphic and it's a heavy subject. But police get to the Hendricks house around 10:30 p.m. They discover there that the back door is closed, but it was unlocked. It's important to note that there was not a sign of forced entry. It was unlocked, and it was also not unheard of. In fact, it was commonplace for back doors to be unlocked at this time in this place. In fact, there are separate reports that after the crime that takes place, there was kind of a rush on door locks at the hardware stores. So a lot of people not only did not lock their doors, they didn't even have locks on their doors. Okay. So the police walk inside to find a horrific scene inside the home. Okay. So they find Susan, Becky, Grace, and Benjamin, and they had all been murdered in their beds. Now, Becky and Grace, the 2 little girls that are 9 and 7, share a bedroom, but they each have their own twin bed. So there's like a bed on one side of the room and on the other side of the room. That's how it's described. The more I read about it, I don't think that the sides of the room were very far apart. So the beds were pretty close to each other in this one room. Now, it was known that Benjamin would sometimes leave his bed in his own room and crawl in bed with one of his sisters. And it seems that that's what happened this night as well. So it appears that both girls were positioned like on their sides as though they had been sleeping when they were murdered. Benjamin's body was a bit different. He was on his back, lying next to Grace. He had crawled in the bed with Grace that evening at some point, and he was lying on his back with his leg dangling like off the side of the bed. So little Benjamin's body had the most damage to it. It had been the most vicious of attacks. Police to this day maintain they think that Benjamin potentially saw his killer. He had been hit multiple times in the face. And when I say hit in the face, the murder weapons, guys, yes, I said weapons. There are 2 of them, and they're different in nature in a kind of way. So the murder weapons are going to be an axe, a large axe, and a butcher knife. So when these are the weapons, and I'm talking about 5-year-old Benjamin's face, you can imagine some sources described that his mandible, so like his lower jaw, was essentially detached from his face. He was unrecognizable. Either way, like I said, the girls were lying on their sides. Benjamin was lying on his back with his leg dangling and in extra force. So that's why it looks like the girls potentially were sleeping when this happened, and Benjamin had in fact woken up at some point during it. Based on the evidence they have, it is believed that Rebecca was killed first, likely from the axe, but she also had a cut on her face from the knife. Grace and Benjamin were sleeping, like I said, in the same bed, and both of their throats were actually cut with the knife before they were also then attacked with the axe. So horrible, horrible, horrible scene. One of the detectives there described the scene actually as the, quote, cleanest bloody crime scene he'd ever seen. So based on forensic analysis, it looks like the killer likely stood between Grace and Becky, like between their two beds when the kids were killed first. And based on this positioning, then the killer would have been absolutely covered head to toe in blood. There's no getting around this. So Susan, the mom, was also found in her bed. She also had been killed with an axe. Based on these forensics, it looks like she was killed before the children. We can talk a little bit about why that would be. And the house looked as though it had been ransacked. So we have drawers pulled out, clothes, toys strewn on the floor, some furniture tipped over, all these kinds of things. But there were no fingerprints, no footprints, no other evidence of anyone else at the scene whatsoever. And none of the victims showed any kind of sign of struggle, at least that could be determined by police at that time. We know that DNA technology and forensic analysis has grown bounds and leaps since 1983. Either way, it is insanely incredible that someone could have gotten as bloody as this person had to then not leave blood anywhere else. For as bloody as this crime was, really there wasn't much blood found throughout the house except for in these bedrooms where the crime took place. To give you an idea of what that might actually look like, there was a blood spatter pattern on the wall. So when the killer stood between Grace and Becky's beds, the blood that came off of their little bodies was in such great volume that it left the spatter on the wall, but almost in an outline of a human, meaning that person took on whatever didn't get to the wall, right? Because he or she is standing between the crime and the wall. So that gives you an idea of how incredibly messy this was and what this killer had on them that they then are going to have to figure out or dispose of, right? So the murder weapons, the axe and the large butcher knife, were found in the bed with Grace and Benjamin. Okay, they both do belong to the Hendricks, like they are from the family home, but generally speaking would be kept in different areas. That makes sense. It's a butcher knife. It's likely going to be in the kitchen. The axe, probably a shed, the garage, something like that. The handles, though, get this, y'all, the handles on the weapons were both wiped clean of blood. No fingerprints were found. So these weapons have been cleaned and laid on top of the bed. We also have this weird ransacked home scene. Okay. But no blood was found at the scene that belonged to anyone other than Susan or the children. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe all four members of the family shared blood. And that's what was found at the scene. There was a faint footprint leading to the back porch, but police can't determine if that was there before the crime took place or not. David will tell you that Susan kept an incredibly immaculate home, particularly with having 3 young children. He said that she cleaned all the time. She took pride in keeping the home clean, and that there's no way in the world a footprint would have been there before these crimes took place. And he says this because we're looking at this to have happened, these murders, overnight between that Monday and Tuesday, Monday night and Tuesday morning. And he said that every Monday actually was her deep clean. So Monday, she's vacuuming, she's mopping, she's doing all the big stuff on that day. So he said there's no way in the world there would be a footprint on a Monday afternoon. This would, in fact, be the cleanest the house typically would ever be. Now, let's go back to those ransacked rooms and things like that. These drawers were strewn open, and while they had blood, these dresser drawers all around them, as you can imagine, you've heard enough of these things at this time, you can get an idea. There was no blood inside the drawers that were open. So pretty much right off the rip, police are saying this looks like a staged burglary. And you know that we've talked about it enough. These would be two incredibly different crimes. We don't often have an actual burglary, someone who has come in with the intent to rob or take your things, a theft, and then an axe murder. These are two very, very different things. You might find someone getting hurt or maybe killed because they are shot quickly in the moment because maybe they interrupted a robbery. But something like this, you don't often see side by side. And so it makes sense that police are saying that it, without a doubt, right off the rip, looks staged. And it looks like that's what they wanted you to think they were there for. So police say that David's response was far from what one would expect. And in fact, it kind of painted him in a bad light to them from the get-go. It was noted that when he gets to the home, so he's made this welfare call. Okay. Remember, he's in Wisconsin on this business trip, about 3.5 hours away. He pretty much immediately takes off and starts heading home to see what in the world is going on there for himself with his own eyes. About that time is when the police are getting there. So by the time David gets to his home, the police are now about 3 hours into this investigation. Crime scene, so you can only imagine the vans, the cop cars, all of it, the crime scene tape, just the buzz that must be surrounding this home 3 hours into finding a scene like this. So when David pulls up, can you imagine how you might feel when this is what you come home to? So he obviously knows something is horribly wrong when he first gets there. And he asks a police officer about his family, to which the officer obviously just has to tell him that, your entire family has been murdered. The police officer will say that the first words out of David's mouth were, "Did they suffer?" Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we've talked about it. We can't ever anticipate how people are going to act. Everybody reacts differently to trauma. People can laugh. People can do very strange things. So this didn't sit right with the police officer, but also just on its own, I'll take it. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Some neighbors have said that he took a knee, made a moaning, guttural sound, and screamed, as I think anyone would. But instead, police are saying that really he then just said, "They're with God now." So, on the "they're with God" part, I don't think David meant that as this cryptic, like, I did this and now they're with God situation. That is how some people take it. If you grow up with religion, if you grow up with Christianity, then the theology behind that religion, like the ultimate goal is to be with God, not that you kill someone or yourself to get there faster. That's not really the idea. But the end game is to be with God. And so that phrase, "they're with God now," is actually a token kind of given as it's to console someone. It's a consoling sentence, or you know, even if it's not something you want to hear. That's usually the intent. People say it all the time. "They're with God now. They're with God now." It's kind of, well, that's the silver lining at least. So for him to say this, especially with his views and his church and his strict, like he was really in it. So to me, him saying it, it almost sounds like he was just saying it to himself. I don't get too hung up on that. He will go on to say that now that he was paralyzed, that his body was paralyzed internally with shock the second he heard the news. And he went on to conduct a few interviews, obviously with the police this night, but even like the next day and things like this. And he said now when he goes back to hear those, he says he doesn't even know who he was. He's like, "I don't remember saying these things. I was fully in shock. So anything I said or did in those interviews, I can't even, it's not like me." Now, what he's referring to is his demeanor, because he looks almost just blank. The emotion that you would expect from this kind of news, this kind of a violent, traumatic murder that took out your entire family, you would expect a certain kind of thing, and he didn't have that. And because of this, police pretty early on were not thrilled with David and what they saw from him. So he goes on to say that they're with God now. It was overheard that one of the detectives, while they're there at the crime scene, after speaking with David, passed another officer and said he's dirty. And what he meant by that was that potentially David was implicated in these murders. So we've talked about the spatter, we talked about the ransacked drawers and these kinds of things, and that partial print. Okay. So David is pretty quickly charged with murder. It doesn't take too long. The motive was said to be that he wanted to pursue other relationships and that the church would frown greatly upon divorce. Okay. There were also whispers of inappropriate behaviors with these models. So he would hire these models to showcase his back braces. All right. So the one that I showed you earlier, he's selling these orthotics. At the time, y'all, we didn't have social media. Commercials were present, but for him to put his product on a commercial, it would probably be like a local cable channel. It wouldn't be this big national commercial. So to advertise his product, he would enlist the help of pamphlets or brochures. That's what what we would find back then for any kind of advertisement. So to do that, he would hire these models to wear the back braces, to put in the brochures, to put at places around in doctors' offices and things like this. Okay. So they start talking about these models and that there had been, like I said, these inappropriate behaviors with them. So there was actually zero evidence to pin on David for these murders. They really had nothing. It was all circumstantial. Okay. So prosecutors relied really heavily on the information about these models, and they continued to attempt to paint a picture of what they called, quote, escalation of aggression. And they make no bones about it. They tell you that that's essentially that's kind of their smoking gun. The biggest thing they have to be able to charge David with these murders is this, quote, escalation of sexual aggression with these models. And we'll talk a little bit about it. But Diana Payne, for instance, this is one of the models. Okay. She was the first model that worked for David. This was in April of 81, so 2 years prior to the murders. She was there for about an hour. It says that she wore her underwear. She wore her bra and panties for part of the session. But then, so he's also fitting these orthotics. He did then ask her to remove her bra for additional measurements. All right. So he applies Vaseline to her because he's making a plaster cast. At the time, you would have done that to make a mold. But the argument goes that, did she need to remove her undergarments for this? So at this time, she's wearing only her underwear while he's putting this stuff on her body and having her be topless so he can fit these orthotics. We've got another model, Cindy Segabiano. She was the second model that worked with David. She worked with him again also in the spring of 81. She wore leotard and tights and eventually was wearing her bra and underwear, but with a doctor gown over it, and she would only remove the parts needed as he fit certain things. She has since said he didn't make her feel uncomfortable at all. She was time. There's a reason I'm telling you about this. We have Renee Atwell, who also modeled for David in the summer of 81. She said that during her sessions, she wore leotard and tight every single time. She never took anything off. She was fully clothed while she modeled these orthotics for him or while he fitted them to her body. We've got Dawn Ruger, who worked sometime around February or early March of 82 with him. She did wear her bra. She said her session lasted about 45 minutes and she wore a robe. But she said that all he did really was use a Sharpie to make various marks on her body to measure out the orthotics as he fit it to her. But he didn't ask her to remove her clothing or anything like this. Guys, I can go on and on and on and on. There were 13 models in total, I think, that we have that testified. And the reason I'm telling you this is because do I think he was a creep with these girls? Yeah, because some of them got fully naked. He never assaulted anyone, but he did, tell them they would need to remove their undergarments to be able to fit these orthotics. That's not, you don't have to. Okay. And they knew this. But Can you be a creep and also not be a murderer? Yeah, you can. So just keep these things in mind. But this was the prosecution's, like I said, their smoking gun. This is all they even had, was to use these models to say that the church would frown so far or so hard upon divorce that he wanted to stray and he wanted to be interested in these other women. And because of that, they're going to say that he killed his family to avoid getting this divorce and disappointing the church. But listen to how they were going to do it. They were going to list these models in a way that were not the order in which he actually saw them. So when you go back to the models the way I just listed them, that is the order that he saw them. So the first girl that came to work with him, he had removed her bra. He was putting Vaseline on her. He was trying to massage her. That was the first one. Let's say the model third or fourth in line may have stayed, fully clothed the whole time. The reason this is important is because the prosecution's charge is that he had that escalation of sexual aggression, remember? So to prove that, they have to show that with each model, he's getting more and more comfortable and he's getting more and more escalated with his sexual aggression. So they present the models to the jury in a completely different order than what was when he met them. So they'll say model number 1, and it may be somebody that was fully clothed. Model number 2, fully clothed. Model number 3, he had her take off her bra. Model number 4, he had her take off her bra and underwear. 5, he then attempted to kiss her or he touched her breast. So they're trying to show this, but to do that, they're manipulating the actual order of events. So it's important to know that and keep that in mind. So that's what was going on with these models. We got pages and pages of testimony from them. Again, we talk about these kinds of things, but two things can be true. He can be a creep. He can also not necessarily be a murderer. All right. So just know that we are going to actually make this a bit of a two-parter. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what they found in the stomach of the victims. And this is why we talked about the food they ingested earlier and the times at which they ingested it. So experts from the defense state that the contents from the stomach move from the stomach to the small intestine in around 2 hours, somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. They're kind of landing on 2 hours. They also say that, so for instance, if they ate this pizza around 7 o'clock, the children at Chuck E. Cheese, if you remember, around 7 to 7:30, this would mean that they would have died before David left that night because they found contents of this veggie pizza in their stomachs, meaning it wouldn't have moved to the small intestine yet, and that would be within that 2-hour window if they ate at 7:30. David's saying he didn't leave the house until between 11 and 12 at night. So this gives them a few hours that he could have potentially killed them and then left, based on the idea that that's exactly how food moves in the body and how it's digested and the rate at which that happens. Okay? Do you think that this is an exact science? Some things are. Do you think this is one of them? Keep thinking about that for a moment. So we have that happen. However, we have other experts that say it a bit differently. And some other experts will say this is in fact not an exact science. And we can use this to determine a lot. We can use it to determine what a victim ate. We can use it to identify some things, potentially even like a location sometimes, depending on if they're foraging or what. We can use stomach contents for a lot of things. We cannot pinpoint an exact time of death on this, though. That is not an exact science. We've got more exact science with a time frame on rigor mortis, let's say, than we do with stomach contents. Some experts will say, in fact, that depending on the level of activity that you do, that different people are going to digest at a different rate. Sometimes just personally, people digest food at different rates. Okay, we know that David said that they played hide and seek. I don't know, would that have made them digest their food more quickly or not? Does that matter? We don't know, but neither did the quote experts on this. So when they were then crossed at trial and asked, is this an exact science? Can you say that you're an expert on this? Almost everyone would say, no, they're not. And they would say, essentially, you know how it can be frustrating when you see these people on, because you know what the other team's doing, right? You know they're trying to get them to get caught up and step on their own toes. But they were saying, are you an expert? And they're like, well, I'm not, because it's not an exact science. So I can tell you what it means, but I can't hang my hat on this was the exact time. So the prosecution didn't have an exact time of death, meaning they couldn't for sure say that David did this, but they're trying to use this witness to say, that, yeah, it was going to be within 2 hours, so David would have been home. This is the most physical evidence, if you want to call it that they had to pin against David. Again, it was all circumstantial, talking about the idea of the church, the idea of these other women. Keep that in your mind. I want to talk to you about how you feel about it. We do know that there was a container with the stomach contents after the fact that got a little mixed up in terms of like whose was whose. So there is some grievance on the defense part that sometimes this stuff was not handled quite properly in the lab. We also have Grace and mushrooms. So Grace, the little girl, one of the little victims, abhorrently hated mushrooms. Her dad will go on to say that she, like, for instance, she wouldn't eat, his example, Chinese food, because in Chinese food, she has a difficult time identifying the mushrooms. So she's terrified she's going to eat one. So she just won't even eat Chinese food. If she has a salad or a pizza or anything like that, she will pick the mushrooms off. And he said, I mean, very, very diligently, she will. If you've ever had a child who's even a little bit picky, you know that to be true. I don't doubt it. Even a little bit. Grace was, let me think, 7 at the time. So she was fully capable of picking these mushrooms. I picked mushrooms off of my pizza. But at Chuck E. Cheese, if you remember, they got that veggie pizza. It did have mushrooms on it. But everything David has said, even her grandmother and a few others, that Grace would not. So the experts are saying that Grace's stomach had plenty of mushrooms in it. And this seems to be a red flag for anyone that knows her, because they just don't feel like that would be true. So that's the stomach contents. Again, that's the most physical of any kind of evidence we have. We do have a psychologist that interviewed and assessed David for the prosecution. This psychologist is Richard Rappaport. He actually was a psychologist that worked on the John Wayne Gacy case. Side note, Gacy's case was also, his trial took place in this same town that David's is taking place in. At just a bit of a different time. But Richard Rappaport, that psychiatrist, did go on to say that after his evaluation, he considers David Hendricks to have borderline characteristic disorder, and he does not find it out of David's realm to be able to commit a murder like this, to be able to snap in the moment and then be plain-faced after. Well, with borderline, it could. We have talked, and we will. I've got another show lined up that we'll talk more in depth about this, but we all have some sort of, I think that we've learned as time has gone on that so many things are on a spectrum or are on a scale. And one of these things, we talk about autism or Asperger's when we hear spectrum all the time. Well, many things are for all of us human beings. So even like a psychopathy. So like your level of having narcissism, having borderline, having whatever, there can be scales of this. And in fact, sometimes people use it to their advantage, because you might be better at this particular career, if you lean this way psychologically a little bit more than others. Either way, I can't speak on for sure whether or not David Hendricks has borderline characteristic personality disorder or not. That is what this one psychologist or psychiatrist that interviewed him and evaluated for the prosecution said at trial. So I've not seen reports of his psychiatric status one way or another before or since then, but that was ruled that way at that time. All right. So another little hiccup on David's end would be that some of his clients, when he was in Wisconsin, when all this took place, said that he didn't seem very prepared and that he kind of cold called them. So while Beverly, his office manager, knew a week prior to this Wisconsin trip that he would be going out of town for business, because the argument is that the murder was premeditated. So he knew he was going out of town. His office manager knew he was going out of town, but these clients in Wisconsin didn't seem to know he was coming. They said he did seem a little disorganized and he seemed a little different in that sense. And that one of them even spoke to say that he didn't have a brace with him. So that would be very interesting, that he wouldn't bring the product that he's trying to sell to them. So that's something of note. David was convicted the following year in November, almost exactly a year later in 1984, and he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences for the murder of his wife, Susan, and his 3 children. But it gets interesting because remember what I told you they had him on? Kind of nothing. You know, you can't just say, I don't like the looks of this guy. I don't like his reaction to things, and then charge with murder. So let me read you what the judge actually said. I've not heard a judge say anything like this quite before. But so when the jury comes back with the verdict, the judge says, quote, I personally believe that the defendant probably did commit these offenses, and I must emphasize that I intend no criticism of the jury or its verdict by sentencing this order. Based on the evidence admitted on trial against the defendant, I am not personally convinced that he has been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Some might say this is a distinction without a difference. However, I feel the very fabric of our justice system depends on this distinction. If the sentence issue were anything other than the most severe and irreversible sanction of death, I would disregard my own concern over the level of proof and render sentence based on the verdicts, as I have done many times before in other cases. However, as to the sanction of death, I hold the same position as do some or perhaps even all of the jurors. I cannot in good conscience apply the sanction of death unless I have been convinced of his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. I have not, and mere belief is not enough. So he's saying that he even thinks David might have done this, but there's no way that they've proven this beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'll be honest with you that if I were on that journey, I'm not sure I could I'm not sure I could convict, because to convict based or to charge and convict based on the laws that we have in place, I don't see anything that shows this has been proven without a reasonable doubt. I have all the doubt in the world. I have doubt he did it. I have doubt he didn't do it, but I most certainly am not certain with evidence and everything else. I mean, plenty of people have gone to trial and not been convicted with much more evidence than this. So I don't know. I find it interesting. I do want to hear what you guys have to say. We do have in 1991, though. So just a few years go by, and in 91, the case was appealed to the Supreme Court of Illinois. All right. So they go on to say when he hires 2 new defense attorneys, take this to the Supreme Court in Illinois. And what they're doing is trying to show how the original case failed to prove fear and retribution from the church that would be a motive in the murder. Because remember, that's what they were trying to do. The reason to bring in the models was to say he had fear that his church would, not like this. And because of that church was so strict. And this is why he'd rather off his family and hope he doesn't get caught than disgrace himself by getting a divorce or straying on his wife. So this is a question. This is a little testimony from a little transcript. This is actually from the People versus David Hendricks. And this is from the Supreme Court of Illinois. And it says, question, when someone is set aside as far as your faith is concerned, does that have to do with the act of the person or the attitude of the person? And he says, well, I think there's some of both. And they say, tell me what you mean. Well, there's the overt act that has to be dealt with. It's as if our children did something naughty and we have to spank them. It's done in love. It's not done with malice in our hearts. We want to bring that person back into, for one thing, the very first thing that we have to remember is that the person is responsible to God for his actions. So this goes on and on and on, talking about the retribution or the punishment you may be receiving from the church if you go against what they vow to uphold in their theology and the way they look at their religion. Ultimately, they can't really do it. They can't prove this retribution that they hung their case on, that he was going to be so terrified of. So it says that this testimony actually fails to show that Hendricks would have had the fear of being ostracized. It's not supported whatsoever. And then you can even learn that one of the witnesses that testify about Susan and her presence at the baby shower was actually another member of this church, of this same church. And she years earlier had actually given birth to a child out of wedlock and was raising a child on her own and was very active in the prayer meetings and social gatherings of the church. So just meaning to say that she had this child out of wedlock, still present in the church. They've not shunned her, banned her, ostracized her whatsoever. So it falls flat. Their motive falls flat. They have nothing else. They got the weapons. They're clean. They don't have any other physical evidence. Even that is a little contradictory. The experts flub on the food, process of digestion through the body and the time that would be. So we don't even have a set timeline. And now all of our circumstantial evidence has fallen through this net. It doesn't hold up. So in 1991, that case was appealed to the Supreme Court of Illinois and actually was overturned. David is out. David is a free man. He has since remarried. He currently has 2 younger children. He lives in Florida. He still has his business. There were reports that leading up to the murder, his appearance changed. He shaved his mustache that was unkempt. He started combing his hair. He cut his hair shorter. He lost weight. He dressed better. So they were trying to use that as, one of the changes that take place sometimes before or after a murder. And he said, look, I had a coupon for a free haircut. As far as the weight loss, my doctor told me a year prior, he said, you can look at my records that I needed to lose weight for my health. He said, so I started losing weight a year prior to their deaths. He said, as far as the clothes, he said, I have no idea what to tell you about clothes. I never knew then that Susan was the shopper. Remember, she was a stay-at-home mom. She went and bought all his clothes. He said, I never bought my own clothes. So in terms of it being a better style or whatever, he remains to say that it must have been something that she liked, that she picked out for him. Maybe it was because he was losing weight. I don't know. But he said, I wasn't changing my appearance. I got a free haircut and wanted to lose weight for my health. I did reach out to David. He was pretty quick to respond. So we went back and forth a few times. Basically, he did confirm he does still live in Florida. He's not on social media. He kind of tries to stay out of any of the limelight at this point. Oh, well, okay, excuse me. That's not true. He did say that he's not on social media a lot. He is on it because he wrote a book. He wrote a book not about his own case and his own family. He wrote a book about his former cellmate who recently got out of prison that was a murderer, but he befriended him while he was in jail for that short time. And I guess they kept in contact and he wrote a book about him. Outside of that, though, he said that essentially he appreciated that I was covering the case and that there would be dialogue about it. But moving forward, he is married with children at this point. Guys, I don't know. So Steve Vogel wrote a book called Reasonable Doubt. I have not yet read it. It came out a few years ago and they actually re-released it in 2018 with 2,000 more words. He's since gotten David's blessing to say more and be more free with what he knows. He was a part of the court case. He was there for all the trial. He knows as good as anyone what went down at that time. So he wrote this book. I'm interested to read it. If any of you have, let me know. I don't know. What do y'all think? Because I'm conflicted. I am conflicted. I know for sure that he shouldn't have been convicted. I'm not saying that he's for sure innocent. I do think that there was not enough evidence. There was not enough to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. A side note, I'll tell you 2 things. We have something weird with the brother-in-law. I will not get in the weeds with this because I do not have a lot of facts other than to say at that time, he was married to Susan's sister, this brother-in-law. He was an orderly at a hospital, and she has said that he has come home around this time came home with bloody scrubs and asked her and was washing them. When she asked him why he had bloody scrubs, he said that a doctor gave them to him. He actually gave this information in an interview with police and said that he named the doctor. They speak to the doctor and he says, no, I did not give him any bloody scrubs. I've worked in a hospital myself for a couple of decades. there's no reason a doctor would give an orderly scrubs to take home to wash. There's not a lot of reasons orderlies would be particularly bloody to begin with. That could be neither here nor there. That is no more concrete evidence than anything else we have currently on David. It's interesting to note, people do get weird and people's feelings can change what they want to say. So at the time, his wife, they were married, and she did tell police that he was home all night that night. They've since gotten a divorce, and she's also since changed her tune to say that he was gone for a few hours that evening. I can't make any more sense of any of that than you guys can, but I will present that information to you just like I read it. And that's about all there is on that. Steve Vogel, the author of the Reasonable Doubt book that is about David Hendricks, has since come back to say that he dances around the fact that he thinks David is innocent. There evidently was some information, he doesn't want to give too much away because he wants you to read his book. Okay. So that's fair. But there's some information, I guess, that it's come up about someone else that they feel pretty strongly could be implicated in these murders. But this man died a couple of decades ago. So even if he had been, that might be lost. We do know the brother-in-law was pretty vocally jealous over the money that David made. There again, that's an interesting, money is an easy motive, but this would be an interesting way to go about vindicating that by killing the family rather than David himself or, destroying his business. I don't know. There's a lot to talk about, but you guys just let me know what you think. I should have said this at the start, but this, if you're not familiar, Night Shift, again, is a true crime show we air every week on Andrea Up Late channel on YouTube at 8/7 Central on Tuesdays, and we drop wherever you listen to your podcast. Tonight, however, is not live because I got to hit a baseball game. So I went on and pre-recorded, and you guys, I will be in the chats though. So I look forward to being in the chats with you and talking to you here in a few minutes once I get where I need to go. But I hope you guys are doing great. Please come back and see us anytime. Take a listen, like, subscribe, do all those great things, and we'll see y'all next Tuesday.